In this video, we're going to cover exceptions. We'll go over the processes of adding, submitting, and reviewing exception records. We'll go over some exception rules, and then also talk about the associated exception to-dos and how they're created and completed. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have access to the exception records and the ability to send exception records to the state. So an exception record is a child record of the NFT record. So it's going to use those same NF transition agent and NF transition state permissions. And also the ability to send it to the state, this button right here, that's going to be controlled by the send to state / save CTA / submit notice permission. So if you've gone through the CTA and Nifty record videos, then you probably are already set up with the appropriate permissions because you would have needed them for those videos as well. But just in case, I'm going to show you what these are in case you haven't done that yet. So up in Manage Users, I'm finding my own user account and clicking Edit and going to User Permissions. And then now I'm seeing the permission list. And so the ones that are important for exceptions is this NF transition agent and NF transition state. Those are going to make it so that I can edit all the agent fields of an exception record and add new exceptions and delete them if I have this level. And then the state one is going to be so that I can view the state review section of an exception. And then the send to state / save CTA / submit notice permission, that permission is responsible for all three of those different actions. And sending to state is something that you need to do for exceptions. So that's going to be, you're going to want to have this permission as well. All right, let's go back to our participant and add an exception. So to add an exception, you're going to want to highlight the exceptions node and click Add. And then you'll need to select the type of exception. So there's 3 different types: the exception to fee or frequency screen, prior authorization for item with no screens, and other. The exception to fee or frequency screen, this would be something like if you had a participant that has moving expenses or household supplies or furniture, and it exceeds $500 for the whole transition, not just per item, then you would have to apply for an exception to the fee or frequency screen. If you had a prior auth, this would be something like some significant services or home modifications, something like a ramp or equipment for the bathroom or modifications to the kitchen, something that needs to be approved prior to installing. So that would be a prior auth. And then other, we don't really expect any others, but it's kind of a just in case option if you have a really weird scenario and the state and you guys have communicated about something else, then maybe you'll need to use other if it doesn't fit into these types. So let's just add an exception to fee or frequency screen. I'm going to click Add. Okay, now that we've added an exception, you can see that the node label has a couple little abbreviations. So the N stands for not yet sent. There is a letter abbreviation for each exception status. There's the N for not yet sent, A for approved or approved with conditions, D for denied, P for pending need info, and R for under review, and then S for submitted to state. So those are all listed in the user guide under the exceptions section. If you need to review those and forget what they stand for, it's kind of self-explanatory because you can tell what kind of state they're in based on if you can edit it or not, and if there's review stuff happening in the state review section. So you don't need to necessarily memorize those, but that's what that is. And then EFS stands for the exception type, the exception fee or frequency screen. And then there also is the prior auth one. So if it was that one that was selected, we'd see PA. See, I'm going to switch it back. And then if it was other, it would be other. And then lastly, as soon as I select a service, the service name will show up, and then if an item type is required, the item type will show up instead of service name because it's a little bit more specific. So I haven't put anything in yet, but if I had, that would already show up. So the HCPCS codes, that's just a standard list of Nifty HCPCS codes that apply to Nifty, and if you select one, then that will change the standard remark field. If there is any standard remarks that are applicable, they'll be populated in here. If there aren't, it'll just say no selection. So if I select another, it's the same thing for item type. If there weren't any item types that applied to that standard remark, then nothing will show up in here. But since I picked this one, there are. And I don't know if you noticed on the left-hand side, that service name has now shown up in the node label. And if I switch this or select this item type, it's going to switch to the item type just because it's a little bit more specific than the service name. So that's the services and node label. Something else to note is exceptions can be added at any time, but they can only be actually submitted to the state after a notice in eligibility has been submitted. So if you haven't submitted your notice in eligibility, the system will show you an error and not allow you to send your exceptions to the state, since no one's going to want to approve exceptions when there isn't even a notice approved. So keep that in mind. Something else is that exception records can actually be added after a Nifty record is closed. This is because sometimes there are issues with billing where you maybe didn't realize you needed a prior authorization or an exception for the fee or frequency screen, and you've already sent it through billing, and then months later they're working through the billing, and then they find out that you've done it wrong and your billing is rejected, but now your record's already closed. Well, in those scenarios, we wanted you to be able to go in and add the exception, get it approved, resolve this billing issue easily without having to reopen your Nifty record when they truly are closed. So we do allow you to add exceptions after the Nifty record is closed. Agencies can also add duplicate service combo exceptions because sometimes there are distinctions in services that aren't covered by these service combos. So whenever this happens, the system will warn you. So if I try to add another exception type, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And I'm going to select the same exact ones. It's going to let me know, hey, this is a duplicate service combination. You can still do this if you want, but we're just going to warn you. So we just do that to make sure that you didn't accidentally add another one. And just because normally you would think that's a bad thing, since why are you giving them the same service? But we do understand that there are some things that are actually different, but our service combos just don't provide enough detail to get that level of difference. So I'm just going to delete this because we don't need this extra one. Okay, so whenever an exception is added to a related exception to do will be added. So if I open up the case file to-do list, I'll be able to see the send exception to state to do. And this is nice because it's just reminding any agent users to complete this process and actually send the exception to the state. And as soon as you do this, the to-do will be deleted and taken care of, and the next kind of to-do will come along. So it's not something that, like, if you don't need that crutch, that's fine. It's not going to bog you down and be another click that you have to do. The system will just automatically complete it. That's why these complete checkboxes are grayed out. Something else to note is that you can edit the title and descriptions, but since the to-do will be deleted as soon as it's complete, I wouldn't put any important information here and save notes that you want to keep because you'll lose them as soon as you complete the to-do. The due date and reminder date default to today's date, like the day that it's added. at 5 p.m. and 8 a.m. You can update these if you have a certain goal date in mind. Normally, people will just probably leave these because then it'll just push it to the top of your to-do list. Okay, so that's the send exception to state to do. So let's talk about what you would need to do to actually send the exception to the state. So you're just going to need to fill out all the required fields before you can send it. If I tried to send it right now, I'd get an error telling me that I need to enter all of the missing data, and I can use the missing button to identify that missing data. So after I've filled out the services, there's only 3 more fields left that are required to submit the exception to the state. It's cost, rationale, and rationale history. It's actually not rationale history, that just shows up funny. Rationale history is this button that would show us the history of whatever you've entered as the rationale over time. If it goes back and forth between the state, this kind of saves a nice dialogue of what's occurred. The other required one is this field that is to describe why the regular criteria, like the established fee and frequency screens, don't meet the participants' needs. So whatever that might be, example of this, you would fill in there. And then for the rationale, it explains exactly what it is, clearly describe the unique needs of the participant. So I do that, and then the total cost, I'm kind of going through this backwards. The total cost is the total cost that you're requesting. So let's just say $100. Okay, so now I've filled out all my required fields except one that doesn't really show up in review missing appropriately, this checkbox down here. This is just something that you have to check with every exception, basically saying that you are following the established procedures that have been worked out between the state and agency, and that you're aware of all this stuff. So I'm going to check that. Oh, something else to note is these add today buttons. They'll just add my user ID and date to the thing so that you know who did it and when, in case people add a dialogue of more comments later on. And that same thing works up here, but I didn't choose others, so I'm not going to use that. So now I have all my missing data. You can see the missing button isn't enabled anymore, indicating that I've filled out all the missing stuff. So when I'm ready, I can click the send to the state button and the exception will be sent. Before I do that, I just want to say one more thing. Exceptions are sent with all other sendable records. So when you click this, if you had other exceptions added, it would require me to, the system will require me to answer all the required fields within that exception as well. And that's same with any other sendable record, and the other sendable records are transition results and closed notice records. So it wouldn't really make sense normally to be sending all those different types at once, just because of the way this process works. But if you got into a weird scenario where you already had a transition result added, then you would need to fill in those fields as well, and same with closed notice. So I'm going to send. Okay, and now it's told me my exception was successfully sent. It says records just in case you sent multiple, that's the default message. And now you can see that the exception record is locked because it's in the state's hands for reviewing, and it's locked for me from any edits. Also, if I refresh this, my to-do list should update. And now the to-do is completed for send to state, and there's a new to-do review exception, and it's with that same the to-do or the exception node label, so that I know which one, since you can have multiple exceptions. So now the state needs to review the exception. I've actually opened up another browser so that we can do this and go over what you'll be waiting on. So I'm going to have to refresh this as well so that it gets the new data. Okay, so since now I'm logged in as a state user, this to-do is editable, and I can click on it and change these fields if I wanted as a state user, and then as an agent user, you'll be locked out of editing this to-do. So the way to complete this is to truly just review the exception. Again, it's not manually completable. You can't check that checkbox if you wanted. It's grayed out. You have to actually just review the exception. So now that I'm logged in as a state user, all these state user fields are enabled for me to edit. So let's just pretend that I approved it. So if I click approved, and the to-do list has to be refreshed. If I went in and out, it would refresh as well, but I'm just going to do that. Now you can see that the to-do for reviewing the exception has been completed, and now there's an acknowledge exception approved to-do. So, which is read-only for state users. And once we go back I'm back as my agent user, Mary Demo, and I refresh, it'll be editable for me because I'm an agent user and I'm the one that needs to acknowledge the exception was approved. So the process for that should really just be going and looking at the exception record and seeing what the state said. If they said anything, oh, they didn't have any comments, great. Or if they did, check that out. If it was approved with conditions, you're going to want to pay attention to that because they might have approved it, but approved it at a different cost. So maybe they filled in this cost field. If it was denied, you'd also want to pay attention because then there'll be a denied reason and maybe some comments as well. And all those things, all those three guys are going to come as the same kind of looking to do. It'll say acknowledge exception approved, or acknowledge exception approved with conditions, or acknowledge exception denied. All of those things are going to be manually completable, where you literally just check this box for the to-do to go away and to kind of acknowledge that, yes, you got it. And the purpose of that to-do is really just to alert you that the state has finished reviewing. But there's other two options that are a little bit different. If the state would have had marked under review, nothing's going to change because if it's under review, it's still not reviewed. So the review exception to do would have still been there for the state to finish. So under review won't cause any changes, but pending need info does. So pending need info means that the agent needs to elaborate a little bit on the to-do and on the exception and maybe change something. Whatever the state's looking for, they'll leave that in the comments section. But as soon as they click that, they'll be locked out of the record and the agent will be able to edit again, and you'll have to resubmit this exception record after you've basically done whatever changes they've requested. And so that'll come up across as exception needs info instead of the one that we're seeing right now. So those are all some of the different pathways that the exception can take. As soon as I actually click this complete box, now my exception to do is completely gone and removed from my to-do list, and there's nothing left to do regarding the exception. Okay, so what else is there to say? Mostly just, I guess, deleting exceptions if you need to delete it and you've already sent it to the state. You're going to have to request that the state does this for you. State users can delete submitted records, but if you hadn't submitted it yet, I would have been able to delete it like I did before by selecting the record and clicking the delete button and then confirm delete. And then when that occurs, the associated to-do will be removed as well. And if you have multiple exceptions, you're going to have multiple exception to-dos. That's why the node label is shown in the to-do. All right, that is exceptions and exception to-dos.